In the damp heart of autumn 1863, when the fog clung to the moors like a shroud, unwilling to lift the village of Blackthorn, End lay nestled in the crook of a forgotten valley in Northumberland, its cottages huddled together as though seeking warmth from one another against the whispers that drifted down from Ashgrove Manor. The manor, a sprawling edifice of weathered limestone and ivestern lad turrets, stood sentinel over the vale. Its windows darkened long before dusk, its chimneys cold even in winter. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, not out of reverence, but as one might speak of a tomb that had never been properly sealed. The Ashgrove family had always been distant proud to the point of reclusiveness, but it was not until the late Lady Eleanor's decline that the estate's silence became something more than mere eccentricity. It became a kind of dread. The youngest of the Ashgrove daughters, Miss Eliza Ashgrove, had once been the bright jewel of county society. 17 years of age, with eyes the color of storm-washed slate, and a laugh that, according to the rector's wife, carried like birdsong through the drawing-room. She was frequently seen riding side-saddle along the bridle paths, her chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, always accompanied by her governess until the spring of '61, when the governess departed on account of nervous fatigue, as the household ledger tersely noted. After that, Eliza was rarely seen beyond the manor's wrought-iron gates. B62. The weekly market-goers claimed they heard music from the east wing on windless nights, piano notes, delicate and halting, as though played by fingers unaccustomed to the instrument's weight. Yet no guest had been received in over a year, and the servants, when glimpsed at all, moved with eyes downcast and lips pressed thin, as though guarding a secret written in their very bones. The manor itself exhaled an aura of containment. Its gardens, once famed for their topiary and rose arbors, grew tangled and wild, the gravel paths overrun with nettles. Shutters remained closed on the southern face, though the sun there was kinder than anywhere else on the grounds, and always beneath the scent of damp earth and rotting boxwood there lingered the faintest trace of camphor and lavandera, perfume once favored by Lady Eleanor, now long confined to her sick room, where she passed her final days murmuring of the girl's shame and the blood that will not be washed clean. It was said that on the night of her death, a single scream pierced the stillness of the estate, not loud, but sharp and broken, like the cry of a fox caught in wire. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crenshaw, who would later disappear without wages or references, claimed she had found Miss Eliza standing barefoot in the gallery at dawn, her nightgown stained with mud, repeating, "He promised he would return before Miss—" But when questioned by the coroner regarding Lady Eleanor's demise, Mrs. Crenshaw merely shook her head, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron into knots, and said nothing more on the matter. Rumors, of course, multiplied in the absence of truth. A farmer's boy swore he'd seen a lantern bobbing near the old ice house long after midnight. A visiting vicar reported hearing footsteps pacing the upper corridor during his brief and unwelcome stay, though all rooms there had supposedly been shuttered for months. Yet the most persistent whisper concerned the basamenta low, stone-walled cellar beneath the west wing, accessible only through a narrow stair behind the scullery. The door to it was never locked, the villagers noted, yet no one could recall ever seeing it opened. Its iron handle was always cold to the touch, ebony sumer, and the flagstones before it bore a faint, persistent dampness that no sweeping could remedy. In the winter of '62, a stray doggon, emaciated terrier with one milky eye, was found whining outside that very door, its paws scratched raw as though it had scrabbled for hours to get in. It refused all food, and died 3 days later in the stable, still facing the manor as if awaiting a call it alone could hear. The Ashgroves made no public explanation for Eliza's seclusion. Officially, she was said to be in mourning, then in delicate health, then abroad for her constitution-ish excuse thinner than the last. Her name vanished from society columns, her portrait was removed from the annual hunt ball program, and when her elder brother, Lord Alistair Ashgrove, assumed the title following his mother's death, he did so without a single mention of his sister. In the obituaries, or the inheritance notices, Alistair was a man of rigid orthodoxy, known for his staunch adherence to the doctrines of familial honor and moral purity. He had once dismissed a groom for the mere suggestion of impropriety with a scullery maid. It was thus no surprise that, when confronted by a concerned neighbor about Eliza's absence, he replied with chilling composure, "My sister is where she must be, for the sake of us all." Those 6 words, repeated in hushed tones at market stalls and over ale in the Crooked Spire, became the unofficial epitaph of a girl already mourned by those who had once known her light. Yet absence, in such an enclosed world, breeds its own kind of presence. The villagers began to mark time not by seasons, but by the manor's silence. No piano now, no laughter, not even the clatter of hooves on the drive. Only the wind through the eaves, and occasionally, so faint as to be imagined, the sound of a woman humming a lullaby in a minor key. It was a tune none could place, though an old shepherd claimed it reminded him of a ballad his grandmother sang before the famines, about a cradle beneath the thorn tree, and a vow made in blood. The manor's windows remained dark, but on certain nights, when the moon hung low and full over the moors, a single candle would flicker in the basement casement, casting a trembling amber rectangle onto the wet grass below. No one ever saw who held it. No one dared to ask, and so Ashgrove Manor became less a house than a question, its walls thick with unspoken penance, its halls echoing not with footfalls, but with the weight of what had been buried live or otherwise beneath the respectable veneer of Victorian propriety. For in that age of gaslight and moral certitude, where reputation outweighed, breath and honor could demand sacrifice, the true horror was never the act itself, but the quiet collective complicity that allowed it to fester in shadow, unseen, unchallenged, and utterly real. Years passed, and Blackthorn End learned the art of forgetting, or, at least, of pretending. The manor's name faded from casual conversation, spoken now only in the clipped tones reserved for ill omens or sudden yet certain objects lingered, surfacing like flotsam from a submerged tragedy. In 1867, during renovations to the vicarage privy, a bundle of water-stained papers was unearthed beneath a cracked flagstone, letters tied with faded violet ribbon, their ink blurred by time and damp, yet still legible enough to send the young curate running to the rector with hands trembling. They were addressed to Miss Eliza Ashgrove Manor, postmarked from Edinburgh, Liverpool, even once from Paris, each bearing the same elegant hand and ending with variations of the same phrase: "I swear upon my soul, I shall return for you before the leaves fall." The final letter, dated October 12, 1861, contained no signature, only a smudged wax seal bearing the impression of a ship under full sail. It was this letter, more than any other, that the rector locked in his desk, not out of propriety, but because its final line, "They will chain you to the lie, but I will carry the truth," had been underlined twice, as though the writer feared it might otherwise be overlooked by eternity itself. More disturbing were the fragments recovered from the manor's own refuse. A local boy, digging for clay near the overgrown kitchen garden in the summer of '68, uncovered a porcelain doll with one glass eye missing and its dress torn at the seams, a plaything far too fine for servant children, and far too intimate in its decay to belong to anyone but the missing girl. The doll's remaining eye, a pale blue flecked with gold, seemed to follow the sun across the yard, and when placed upright, it always tilted slightly toward the west wing. The boy's mother, upon seeing it, grew so pale she fainted cold onto the hearthstone. She would not speak of it again, though neighbors swore they heard her weeping softly every night for a week, whispering, "Poor lamb, poor caged lamb." Around the same time, the village apothecary, Mr. Henshaw, man known for his discretion and his fondness for cataloguing curiosities, purchased a set of silver hairbrushes from a departing scullery maid who claimed they had fallen from her mistress's dressing table. During the great quiet, etched into the ivory handle of one was a tiny, almost invisible inscription: EA+JM, entwined beneath a weeping willow. The apothecary kept the brushes in a locked case behind his ledger desk, and though he never displayed them, he was often seen polishing them late at night, long after closing, his face lit by a single oil lamp, and his expression unreadable. But it was the diary that changed everything. Not discovered, but delivered on the doorstep of the county archives in Hexham on a rain-lashed morning in April 8, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. No note accompanied it, only a sprig of dried lavender tucked between its pages, brittle and sweet-smelling, even after decades. The journal belonged to Lady Eleanor Ashgrove, and though much of it concerned household accounts and genealogical musings, the final entries, penned in a hand grown shaky with illness and outrage, painted a picture too precise to dismiss as delusion. "Eliza has confessed," she wrote on September 3rd, 1861. Not in words, but in the curve of her belly, that shameful swell beneath her corset, she names him a scholar, a poet Lise, all of it. His letters reek of theatrics and foreign coin. C'est is ruiné. The Ashgrove name, spotless since the reign of Queen Anne, now bears the stain of a bastard's conception. 2 days later, Alistair has consulted Dr. Pembroke. The child must not be born under this roof, nor shall she leave it, bear in that shame into the world. There is a place beneath the ice-house stairs where no sound escapes. She will stay there until nature takes its course, or God shows mercy. The final legible entry, dated October 17th, was barely more than a scrawl. She sings to it, even now, even in chains. Witnesses, long silent, began to speak not in public, but in corners, over tea gone cold, in the hush between church bells. Old Mrs. Drayton, who had served as laundress at the manor for 40 years, confessed to her daughter on her deathbed that she had once been summoned to the basement to deliver linens, not bedsheets, mind, but swaddling cloths, soft as milk-skin. Though none were born in that house for 20 years, she claimed the air down there was warm, unnaturally so, and that the stone walls wept a fine condensation that smelled faintly of rosewater. Another servant, a stable hand by the name of Thomas Greaves, admitted he'd been ordered to reinforce a section of the cellar wall in late '61 with fresh mortars, though no cracks had been visible. It weren't for mending, he told a fellow drinker at the Crooked Spire in a voice thick with porter and gilt. It were for sealing, and when I pressed my ear to the stones after, I heard breathing, not heavy, not frantic, just steady, like someone waiting. He was found dead 6 months later, drowned in a rain-swollen ditch, his pockets filled with river stones, and a single dried violet. Most unsettling of all were the sounds, reported by those who passed the manor at night. Not screams, never screams, but rhythms, a low, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on stone, always in groups of 3. A child's voice, too thin to be real, singing fragments of Rockabye Baby in a key that made dogs howl and horses shy. On still evenings, when the fog pooled in the valley like mercury, villagers claimed they could hear the faint chime of a music box, delicate, ornate, winding down, but never quite stopping. One postman, delivering a summons in 1872, the matter long forgotten. The case dismissed for lack of evidence, swore he saw a face at the basement window as he turned to leave. Pale, gaunt, with eyes too large for its skull, pressing against the glass with hands so thin the bones seemed to glow through the skin. He dropped the letter, fled on foot for 3 miles, and never walked the Blackthorn route again. His replacement found the summons wedged beneath the manor's front door a week later, perfectly dry, as though placed there with care. These were not ghost stories, not in the vulgar sense. There were no rattling chains, no spectral carriages, no wailing banshees. The horror lay in the tangible, the letters, the doll, the hairbrushes, the dye-rich artifact. A nail in the coffin of plausible denial. They spoke not of hauntings, but of a life interrupted, not ended, of a vow broken not by the lover, but by the family. And beneath it all, like the slow pulse of groundwater through limestone, ran the terrible certainty that whatever had been done in Ashgrove's cellar had not been done in haste, nor in passion, but with the cold, deliberate finality of those who believe they are preserving something sacred, even if it means burying the living beneath it. By the autumn of 1875, the silence surrounding Ashgrove Manor had grown so dense it seemed to muffle even the wind. Yet silence, like still water, often conceals currents far beneath the surface. It was in this year that Mr. Edmund Vail, a junior fellow of antiquarian studies at Trinity College, Cambridge, arrived in Blackthorn End under the guise of researching regional estate architecture for a proposed monograph on Northern Gothic revivalism. He was a man of unassuming, parental, but stooped, with spectacles that magnified eyes, too curious for his own good end. He carried with him letters of introduction from the bishop himself, which granted him access to parish records, tithe maps, and, after considerable persuasion, the reluctant cooperation of Lord Eliza Ashgrove, who by then had grown reclusive to the point of near invisibility. Vale's true interest, however, lay not in cornices or but in the peculiar gap in the Ashgrove household accounts between late 1861 and mid-1863, a period during which expenditures for linen, medicinals, and ironmongery spiked inexplicably, only to vanish entirely thereafter. More telling was the absence of any record of a burial, stillbirth, or even a physician's visit during those same months, despite local testimony that Lady Eleanora had died in November not 1861 as the headstone claimed. Vale began his investigation with methodical restraint, interviewing those few villagers still willing to speak. He noted with quiet alarm how certain names, Mrs. Crenshaw, Thomas Greaves, the scullery maid with the hairbrush's head, all vanished within 18 months of Lady Eleanor's death, their departures recorded only as relocated or dismissed with references. Yet no forwarding addresses existed, no subsequent employment verified. He cross-referenced the letters found near the vicarage, with shipping manifests from Leith and Hull, and discovered that a Mr. Julian March poet, minor dramat, and known associate of Bohemian circles in Edinburgh had indeed booked passage to Paris in September 8, but had never arrived. His name appeared on no immigration rolls, no hotellerie histories, no death notices. It was as though he had dissolved into the Channel fog. Vale, however, uncovered a single clue, a pawnbroker's receipt from Marseille, dated January 1862, for a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials J, redeemed by a woman using a forged letter of credit bearing the Ashgrove crest. The clerk who processed the transaction later drowned in the viewport. His body never recovered. The diary of Lady Eleanor, now in the custody of the Hexham archivist, yielded further anomalies upon closer inspection. Vale, trained in forensic paleography, observed that the ink used in the final 5 entries differed chemically from that of the earlier pages, more acidic, prone to feathering. Moreover, the paper itself, though matching the diary's binding, bore a watermark inconsistent with the manufacturer listed in Lady Eleanor's stationery orders. The conclusion was inescapable. Someone had inserted those pages posthumously, crafting a narrative of maternal condemnation to justify what had already been done. But, by Alistair lacked the literary finesse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crenshaw, could barely sign her name. Vale began to suspect the diary was not a confession, but a cover-on elegantly constructed alibi, written in the voice of the dead to shield the living from scrutiny. His inquiries turned then to the manor's physical fabric, with Lord Alistair's begrudging permission granted only after Vale promised to omit domestic irregularities from his published work. He was allowed to tour the West Wing, including the scullery and the infamous basement stair. The air there was thick with a scent of mildew and something else, something sweetly organic, like overripe peaches, left in a closed drawer. The door to the cellar opened without resistance, its hinges silent, as though recently oiled. Inside, the space was sparse. A stone table, an iron brazier long cold, shelves lined with empty jars, but Vale noticed what others had not. A section of the far wall, roughly 5 feet square, bore tool marks inconsistent with the original masonry. The mortar was newer, paler, and when he tapped it lightly with his walking stick, it returned a hollow echo. Beneath his fingers, the stone felt unnaturally warm. That night, lodging at the Crooked Spire, he dreamed of a woman humming the same minor-key lullaby described in village testimony, her voice threading through the walls like smoke. He woke, drenched in sweat, convinced he had heard, just before dawn, the soft click of a music box winding down in the room above, though the innkeeper swore the attic had been empty for years. Vale's obsession deepened. He obtained, through discreet channels, the original architectural plans of Ashgrove Manor, drafted in 1804. They revealed a chamber beneath the eyes Howson marked on later, revisions described only as vault for perishables, yet its dimensions matched no cold storage of the era. Instead, it included features more suggestive of confinement: an internal latch on the door's inner side, ventilation shafts too narrow for a grown man to pass through, and a drainage channel running directly into the bedrock below. When Vale returned to the manor under the pretense of sketching cornices, he measured the exterior walls. The west wing was 6 inches thicker than the plans indicated, 6 inches the width of a narrow room. He began to correlate testimonies with lunar cycles: the sightings of the candle in the basement window, the tapping sounds, the music box all clustered around the full moon. More chillingly, they aligned with the estimated gestational timeline of a child, conceived in late spring 1861. If Eliza had been confined in September, as the forged diary suggested, then the child would have been born or perished sometime in June 1862. And yet the disturbances had not ceased with birth. They had intensified. Vale found himself haunted not by visions, but by absences: the lack of a death certificate, the absence of mourning clothes in the household inventory, the silence where his sister's name should have been. He began to suspect that the horror was not that Eliza had been imprisoned, but that she had never stopped being a mother, even in chains, and that the child, whether living or stillborn, had never truly left her side. The villagers, sensing his fixation, grew wary. Children were pulled from the street when he passed. Curtains twitched shut. The rector, once cooperative, now refused to meet his gaze. Only the old shepherd, now bent nearly double with rheumatism, would speak plainly. "You're tracing the shadow of a wound that won't scar over," he said, spitting tobacco into the heather. "Some doors, once opened, don't close, not for the living, and not for the dead." Vale took no comfort in the warning. Instead, he returned to the manor at dusk one evening, armed with nothing but a lantern and a notebook, and sat on the cellar steps until long after midnight, listening. And though he heard no voice, no music, no footfall, he did hear once, just once, the sound of a single drop of water falling onto stone. Then another, and another, not from a leak, from something breathing. By the winter of 1876, Edmund Vale had ceased to be a scholar and had become something closer to a sentinel, pale, sleepless. His notes no longer confined to architectural detail, but filled with marginalia that blurred the line between observation and invocation. He took lodgings in a tumble-down cottage on the edge of the Ashgrove grounds, renting it from a distant cousin of the late Lady Eleanor, who asked no questions and accepted payment in books rather than coin. There, surrounded by maps, transcribed testimonies, and vials of dust scraped from the cellar walls, Vale began to piece together what he dared not yet name. Not a crime, but a covenant. His research led him beyond Blackthorn End. 2 forgotten ecclesiastical records in Durham, and private collections in York, where he uncovered references to an obscure 17th-century practice among the landed gentry known only in whispers as the binding vow. It was not a legal instrument, nor a religious rite, but a familial oath, sworn in extremis, wherein a disgraced daughter might be ritually severed from the lineage, her existence unacknowledged, her bloodline expunged not through death, but through erasure. She was to be kept alive, yet rendered invisible, fed, yet unfed by society, remembered only as absence. The vow was said to require 3 witnesses, one of whom must be of clerical standing, and it was always sealed with an object of intimate significance: a lock of hair, a wedding band, a child's shoe braid beneath the threshold of the place of confinement. Vale returned to Blackthorn End with renewed urgency. He combed the manor's threshold stones, the lintels, the hearths, until beneath a loose flagstone near the scullery door he found it, a small velvet pouch, desiccated with age, containing a single pearl button, a twist of chestnut hair tied with black thread, and a tiny silver rattle engraved with the initials Eliza Ashgrove. The rattle, when shaken, emitted no sound. Its interior was filled with wax, In the parish register, Vale discovered that the local curate a man named Reverend Silas Thorne, had resigned abruptly in January 1862, citing nervous exhaustion. His final entry in the vestry minutes noted only, "Attended private matter at Ashgrove. May God forgive what hands I have lent to silence." Thorne was found dead 1 month later in a locked room at an inn in Bury. The cause listed as apoplexy, though the coroner's report, unearthed by Vale in a dust-choked archive, mentioned ligature marks on the wrists and a Bible clutched so tightly the pages bled ink into the palms. The pattern was now undeniable. Eliza had not merely been hidden, she had been exiled. Her pregnancy had triggered not punishment alone, but a ceremonial unmaking, and in that unmaking, something had taken root. Vale began to notice that certain events recurred with mathematical precision. Every year on October 12th, the date of Julian March's last single white rose would appear on the manor's front step, though no roses grew on the estate. Every June 21st, the longest day, the basement window would fog from the inside, as though someone breathed against the glass in the cold morning air. Most disturbingly, on the anniversary of Lady Eleanor's supposed death, November 3rd, the music box melody would be heard not outside, but within the manor itself by no one, yet audible to all who passed nearby. Vale's health deteriorated. Lost weight. His hands trembled constantly. He wrote letters to the Royal Society of Antiquaries that were never sent, filled with phrases like sentient architecture and memory embedded in stone. He ceased shaving. Villagers reported seeing him at dawn, standing motionless before the manor's west wall, tracing the outline of the hidden chamber with his fingertips, whispering to it as one might soothe a fevered child. He began to record sounds using a newly acquired Edison phonograph, still a marvel to most, placing its horn against the cellar door for hours on end. The resulting cylinders, when played back in his cottage, contained mostly silence, but on one, faint, beneath the crackle of wax, came the unmistakable sound of a lullaby being hummed broken, off-key, but undeniably human, and beneath it, the softer, rhythmic gurgle of an infant too young to speak. Vale played it until the cylinder wore thin, until the sound became part of his dreams, until he could no longer distinguish memory from recording. He sought out the last living witness, the apothecary, Mr. Henshaw, now an old man confined to a wheelchair by gout. When Vale showed him the silver rattle, Henshaw wept openly, his rheumy eyes fixed on the ceiling as though reading confession from the plaster. "She wasn't mad," he said, voice raw. "Not at first. She wrote She wrote pages, folded them small, pushed them through the crack beneath the door. Poems, mostly, about the moon, about waiting, about a ship that never came home." He paused, then added, "One night I heard her singing to something that couldn't answer, and then it did, not with words, with breath, with movement. That's when I knew she hadn't lost the child. That's when I knew they'd kept them both." Henshaw died 3 days later, his final words scribbled on a scrap of paper clutched in his fist. "The vow binds the living, but the dead keep the key." Vale, now possessed by a quiet desperation, turned his attention to the land itself. He walked the perimeter of the estate at all hours, noting how the grass grew thicker and greener near the west wing, ebon in frost. He dug shallow test pits and found fragments of bone-gnawed animal, not human, but too small to identify, mixed with shards of porcelain and threads of faded silk. He consulted a retired surgeon, who examined the fragments under magnification and concluded they belonged to an infant no more than a few weeks old. Yet there was no grave, no burial record, no mourning token beyond the rattle. The child had existed, had perished, yet had never been laid to rest because Vale realized with dawning horror it had never been acknowledged as born. In the eyes of the vow, it was a phantom, and phantoms, it seemed, did not sleep. His final discovery came not from paper, but from sound. One moonless night, He placed the phonograph horn against the hidden wall in the cellar and left it running for 6 hours. When he returned at first light, the cylinder was spent. But as he listened, straining past static and wind, he heard its 3 distinct knocks, followed by a pause, then 2, then 1. Acode? Aplea? Or simply the rhythm of a heart long stilled yet still echoing in the marrow of the house. Vale transcribed the pattern into his journal, then, in a hand grown unsteady with revelation, wrote beneath it, "They did not chain her to silence. They chained silence to her." And silence, once bound, learns to speak. He did not sleep that night, nor the next. He sat at his window, watching Ashgrove Manor in the false dawn, and for the first time, he did not see a house. He saw a vessel, and inside it something waiting not for rescue, but for witness. Spring came late to Blackthorn End in 1877, arriving not with birdsong, but with a persistent drizzle that turned the moorland paths to slurry and seeped into the bones of every stone wall. Edmund Vale, by then a ghost of his former self, had stopped writing in ink. His journal entries were now scratched in charcoal, smudged by rain or perhaps by tears, each page less a record than a plea etched into the margins of reason. He had ceased visiting the manor by day, choosing instead the hours between midnight and when the veil between what was and what remained seemed thinnest. It was during one such vigil in the small hours of May 3rd, the date inscribed on the back of Eliza's last known letter, that the revelation came, not as a vision, but as an absence of sound. De winde dieth. The owls fell silent. Even the drip of water from the eaves ceased, and in that hollow stillness, Vale understood. The horror was not that Eliza had been imprisoned, nor even that her child had died. The horror was that they had never been meant to be forgotten. The vow, he realized, was not merely punitive, it was generative. By severing Eliza from the world, the Ashgroves had not erased her. They had consecrated her. They had made her a guardian of shame, a living reliquary for the family's hidden stain. And in doing so, they had bound her consciousness to the very stones that confined her, weaving her grief, her love, her maternal vigil into the architecture itself. The truth unfolded in fragments, each more devastating than the last. Vale discovered, buried in a solicitor's box of unclaimed estate papers, in a sealed affidavit dated December 1861, signed by Lord Alistair, Reverend Torne, and Dr. Pembroke, the same physician mentioned in Lady Eleanor's forged diary. It made no mention of chains or cells. Instead, it spoke of voluntary seclusion for the preservation of moral order, and included a clause rarely invoked in English law, custodia perpetua ad, a form of custodial confinement wherein the subject, deemed unfit for society yet not mad enough for bedlam, was to be maintained in total isolation until such time as her transgression be absolved by divine will. But the document contained a handwritten in Alistair's tight script. She insists on keeping the child. God help us. She calls it mercy. There was no record of the child's death, no burial permit, no baptismal entry, only silence deliberate, cultivated, and absolute. Vale pieced together the final days. Eliza had not been dragged to the cellar in fury, but led there in sorrow, wrapped in her mother's shawl, clutching Julian March's last letter to her chest. The room had been prepared not as a dungeon, but as a sanctuary, a lie made tender. Warm bricks lined the walls to ward off damp. A small stove provided heat. Books of poetry, her own childhood toys, even a cradle carved from ash wood stood ready. They had given her everything but freedom, everything but recognition, and in that terrible generosity they had ensured her suffering would not end with despair, but with devotion. She sang to mercy every night. She marked the passage of years, not by seasons, but by the child's imagined growth. First steps never taken, first words never spoken, birthdays celebrated with whispered songs and cakes of stale bread. And when Mercy Sickenval found the evidence in a hidden compartment beneath the cellar floor, a tiny shift stained with fever sweat, a spoon blackened by laudanum, a lock of fine pale hair tied with blue ribenda mother did not scream. She hummed. She always humme. The music box, Vale learned from a tinker in Hexham, who claimed to have repaired it in '59, had been a gift from Julian March upon their engagement. Its mechanism played a German lullaby called Schleif, Mein Prinzen, but Eliza, either by design or by grief's distortion, had wound it so often that the pins on the cylinder wore unevenly, transposing the melody into a haunting minor variation that no living composer had ever written. After her confinement, the box was left on the mantel of her old bedroom until it began to play by itself on still nights. It was moved to the attic, then to the icehouse, then finally, according to a servant's diary, Vale uncovered beneath floorboards in the east wing, placed with her, as se behead the last time I saw her face. Vale knew then that Eliza had not died in that cellar. She had simply ceased to require food, or light, or breath, in any form the world recognized. Her life had thinned into presence, her body into echo, and Mercy Witherbourne still, or living only a few weeks, had never left her side. Not because the child lingered a spirit, but because Eliza's love refused the boundary between life and death. In the quiet hours, they were together, mother and child, bound not by chains of iron, but by the unbreakable cord of a vow, made not by the family, but by her own heart. Tapping, the breathing, the candle glow, not signs of entrapment, but of vigil. She was waiting not for Julian March, who had vanished into the sea, or shame, or suicide, but for someone to come and say aloud what no one ever had: you were not ruined. You were loved. Your child was real. Vale wrote one final letter, not to the society, not to the press, but to the rector of Blackthorn End, with instructions to be opened only after his death. In it, he confessed that he had entered the sealed chamber, not through the wall, though he had chipped at it until his fingers bled, but through acceptance. He had sat in the cellar for 3 nights straight, speaking softly of Eliza's poems, of Julian's letters, of Mercy's name. On the 3rd night, the music box played not from a cylinder, but from the air itself, notes rising like breath from the floorboards. And when dawn came, he found a single white camellia on the stone table fresh. To Keast, though no camellia had bloomed on the estate since Lady Eleanor's death, he left it there. He knew better than to take proof. Some truths are not meant to be held, only witnessed. He died on June 21st, 1877, the longest day of the year. The innkeeper who found him said he was seated by the window, facing Ashgrove Manor, a faint smile on his lips, his hand resting on an open journal. The final entry read, "She is not haunting the house. The house is holding her, and perhaps, in time, it will let her go." His body was buried in the village churchyard, far from the Ashgrove plot, but on the anniversary of his death each year, villagers report that the path leading from his grave to the manor gate is always damp with dew, even in drought footprints leading not away, but toward the west wing, fading just before the scullery door.